Okay, great. So here we are. Thank you for coming today for this panel on genres. I will just we have, and I apologize, I didn't run the pronunciations of your names past you guys, but Vladislav Areshka, Caitlin Gerrard, and Susen Halank. And so we'll begin with Vladislav Areshka, a newly discovered prose piece by Emily Dickinson. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I will share my presentation. Can you see? Is everything fine? Can you see my presentation? Okay, perfect. Thanks again for joining in, and thanks for this opportunity. Hello, everyone. I'd like to start by saying that not everything a library holds is an author. So, texts get lost, recovered, and sometimes reshape what we know of a writer's legacy. And this presentation argues that one of Emily Dickinson's lost texts may actually have been found. Dickinson's love of writing showed early. As a student at Amherst Academy, together with her friends, she edited a paper called Forest Leaves, and her friend Emily Fowler remembered her as a humorist of the comic column, one of the wits of the school. But don't get too excited now, for Forest Leaves is probably lost and will remain so for now because the text I've discovered isn't from it. And still, Emily Fowler's testimony matters, because she calls Dickinson's contributions irresistible and points to two other publishing venues, two paragraphs in the Springfield Republican and a piece stolen by a roguish editor for the college paper, where she says Dickinson's touch was instantly recognized. Scholar Alfred Haberger, in his biography My Wars Are Laid Away in Books, identifies a stolen piece as a prose valentine from 1850, published in The Indicator, Amherst College literary magazine, and famously beginning Magnum Bonum Harum Scarum, which was also likely addressed to George Gould, a friend of Dickinson's brother Austin. But I propose an alternative candidate. Unlike The Indicator Valentine, which references Dickinson's dog Carlo, my text is anonymous, with no biographical clues to reveal its author, and it survives only in print in an Amherst College student publication, so handwriting and analysis is impossible. Authorship must instead rest on stylistic analysis, which is examining, as one scholar puts it, the patterns of choices among linguistic possibilities that make up an individual style, like vocabulary, semantics, grammar, punctuation, orthography, and comparing them with Dickinson's known prose letters, which all accumulates to answer just one question. Does this anonymous text really belong to Dickinson's pen? So without further ado, let me reveal the text to you. It reads, Local, Commencement Week 1848. Another great week is about to be recorded in the annals of man. Time is about to unroll another scroll upon which history will write a new chapter of immortality. The great height of the world is peeled, and the images now impressed on its retina is Amherst College. The week to which we refer is the one in which the 10th of August is warmly nestling. Tuesday Eve. A sea of upturned faces reposing on bonneted hats will reflect the light of its smiles and approbation of the Herculean efforts of 8 young men striving for glory, immortality, and a copy of Mrs. Hammonds. Behold the Ciceros and Demosthenes of the freshmen and sophomore classes. Wednesday. Jolt. We will be silent now. What do you hear of him? Listen to the voice of fame. Clark, to whom the evening is given. Rumor is already heralding his name. The world will soon know it. Thursday, 10th of August. O day big with great events, a day in which a cloud of glory will burst upon the devoted hands of 29 young men about to plunge into the arena of life. contemplate for the space of 3 inches upon this great day the sights and sounds, the brain of music from its brazen throat, the gathering of the crowd and the assembling of paddlers, the rumbling of gathering wheels, the rushing to and fro, the vibration of white pants, the fluttering of gay ribbons, the perspiration of fat men and women, the white arms and smiling faces, the jostling of the crowd, the proctoritate mihi commissa, the distribution of decorated sheepskins, and finally, the scattering of the audience to the 4 winds of heaven. So this text appears in the College Cucumber, a satirical student magazine, poking fun at student life and the professorship, that lasted only a single issue and leaving no traces of explicit biographies for its contributors, who were hidden behind pen names. The text sits in the column titled Local, suggesting an author from outside the college circle and someone local to Amherst. The piece describes the 1848 commencement week starting on August 8th, then a major event not just for graduates and friends, but also for the whole town, when the rural population, done with summer's hard work, turned out for a holiday and spectacle. Professor Tyler's History of the College recalls crowds thrown in the streets, clustering around booths and stalls and listening to auctioneers, criers, street orators. And actually Dickinson's niece, Martha Bianchi, remembered her aunt's excitement at the season, saying, "Everything will soon be all in a buzz." The Cucumber piece shares the same excited and somewhat pompous tone. By August 3rd, 1848, Dickinson had finished her studies in Mount Holyoke and returned to Amherst, making her absolutely available to contribute this ironic essay and pass it down to the editors. Austin, then a sophomore, may himself have been among the magazine's editors, and which is a connection worth investigation. And so this context sets the stage for the stylistic analysis itself. So given today's time limit, I can only share a few of the key clues, but a full article will follow in the future. I need to say first that when I came across this text while researching the college's student publications, I was engulfed by the sense of the pure distilled Dickinson at several levels. So one of the first things you may notice ocularly is the use of punctuation, and in particular the dominance of dashes, better, this excessive use of dashes in the Cucumber piece. This is a trait not foreign to Dickinson's style, and even in her younger years. For comparison today, I try to choose examples of Dickinson's writings most contemporary to the Cucumber text of around 1848. So we take her Valentine letter to a relative, William Cowper Dickinson, from February 1849. The dashes actually have a mixed function. One is of a paratactic divider, meaning that they join parts of a sentence that are elliptical or simply have no conjunctions. So they have different distinct clauses that just imply the connection rather than show it graphically. And they deliver brief, punchy images while demanding also pauses from a reader when declaiming the text. Like, for example, in Petula's first flower, I will keep for you, in Dickinson's 1849 Valentine, or in a letter to her uncle Joel Warren Norcross in January 1850. She has very prolific use of the dashes. So she has, sleep carried me away and a dream passed along, a dream all queer and curious. It was a dream of warning. I ought not to hide it from whom it concerns. God forbid that you trifle with visions so strange. The spirit of love entreat you, the spirit of warning guide, and all the helping hold and prevent you from falling. And now, compared to how an anonymous author manages his or her language in the Cucumber. For example, the last paragraph, Wednesday, short, we will be silent now. Would you hear of him? Listen to the voice of Thorn. So secondly, we may also notice a coincidence of how Dickinson likes to use enumeration, piling together details for description, and see the same Uncle Joe's letter, a paragraph format, and we can observe the same in the cucumber. So we have, for example, soon the change came. The young men were old, the flocks had no shepherd, the boat sailed alone, and the dancing had ceased, and the wine cup was empty, and the summer day grew cold, all fearful the faces then. And a similar structure, just listing of different images, we have in the cucumber, contemplate for the space of 3 inches upon this great day, the sights and sounds, the brain of music from its breaking throat, the gathering of the crowd and assembling of paddlers, etc., etc. And all the same also, coincidentally, we can say the same exclamation with all fearful the faces then, all day big with great events. And everything divided in the very same manner with dashes. But to identify authorship, we need more. And so when we want to find, we need to find identical structures by grammar, by logic. And for example, we can notice how a somewhat rhetorical question directed at the reader in the cucumber, this short, we will be silent now. What do you hear of him? Listen to the voice of fame, is reflective of Dickinson's own manner of conversing with her own interlocutors through letters, for example, with Albridge Gridley Baldwin, and you were God, what do you answer it? Or to Uncle Joe's letter, war, sir, my voice is for war. Would you like to try a duel? Or is it that too quiet to suit you? Etc. You can also notice in the cucumber piece the use of italics, which are used to highlight several words and phrases, build, warmly nestling, we. The use of italics signals the author underscoring the words in handwriting, which Dickinson did, and not only occasionally, as we can see, for example, from this letter to a Belarus from October 1848. My friends, really, once. What is interesting that the graphical presentation of the date, the 10th of August, in the cucumber, coincides with how Dickinson transcribes in her letter to friend Beirut of the same year, the 1st of March. Next, also tell me, weren't capital letters and other features that actually attracted your attention at first sight? And we have immediately history, chapter, and later on rumor, all in capital letters in the cucumber piece. And we can easily compare them to how Dickinson gives a role in her narratives, not only to an eagle or a ram in somewhat animate figures in her William Cowper Dickinson letter, but also in her Uncle Joe's letter, she even capitalizes chloroform. Next, I would like to make several examples of some syntactic choices, which are sometimes so repetitive in Dickinson's that they are the spitting image of what we find in the cucumber. My favorite example of that is in her persistent use of time clauses at the beginning of the sentences, especially at the beginning of the sentences, and her concerns with time in general, especially using the time words like week and year as the main subject of a sentence. So the cucumber author is strangely identical in the style feature. So we read in the cucumber, another great week is about to be recorded. And we have in Dickinson, the last week has been a merry one in earnest, or another year long one that the stranger to us all must leave. And we have in the cucumber, the week to which we refer, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and the same focus on time at the beginning in other parts of the same letter of the 1849 Valentine, last Wednesday Eve, last week, another, as I mentioned. And get into parallelisms, finally, in the lexical and semantic components of the cucumber piece versus Dickinson's letters. I'll avail first of Vivian Pollack's summary of Dickinson's early style. She says, Dickinson's Valentines, typical of her early humor, at its most self-consciously literary. She parodies the voice of pretentious wisdom and self-indulgent emotion, extracting the revenge of youth on age. In prose, she mimics the Bible, hymns, sermons, prayers, moralistic letters of advice to the young, and bombastic oratory. And actually, you name it, we can find it in the cucumber. The voice of pretentious wisdom or bombastic oratory, we have a day in which a cloud of glory will burst upon the devoted heads of 29 young men. You want biblical references. And we have, finally, the scattering of the audience to the four winds of heaven. I would also add here the use of Latin, which is quite notable in Dickinson in general. And recurrent in Dickinson's prose and poetry, we have also in the cucumber the proctoritate mihi commissa, which we can compare to Dickinson's Magnum Bonum Harum Scarum, for example, in the 1850 Valentine, and also Uncle Joel's letter, plus many other examples in the poems. Furthermore, we find a correspondence of embedding in quotation marks some of citations from popular readings. For example, the 1849 Valentine contains, as you can see on the right, contains a reference to Caroline Orne's poem, The Death Bell, call us to join their band within the silent land. While in the cucumber, the image of a sea of upturned faces reposing on bonneted heads is very likely from the Scottish author Walter Scott's Rob Roy, Waverley novels. And I underline his origin because another curious fact would be that Dickinson demonstrates right at the time of the cucumber piece her being in this somewhat Scottish mood by using the Scots word we. I mocked the we harm in her letter of August 1848. A peculiar set of imagery in the
Vladislav, sorry to interrupt. I just want to give you a note on time, just so you're approaching the limit. I just
okay, perfect.
want to make sure that, thank you.
Yes, I will be quick. So we have also a peculiar set of imagery in the cucumber, referred to smiling Manchurian. For example, you can see obvious correspondence with these metaphorical expressions of the light of its smiles in the cucumber and having laughing beams in Dickinson's letter, while she also is very poignant and punchy with ancient gentlemen and spinsters, and the cucumber author having the perspiration of fat man and implied women. But the best example, I would say, would be if Dickinson's used not specific topics, but specific vocabulary. And in this case, we have the exact same phrases used just around 2 months apart. Dickinson's letter to Austin containing within sight and sound of you all, and this is the exact same phrase, the sight and sound used in the cucumber. So let's say, as with other stylistic markers and tactics that reappear in Dickinson's language, she reuses to her liking throughout her life such occurrences strongly connect the commencement week comical text with the rest of Dickinson's artistic album. At least this is my suggestion. And just briefly, I wanted to show you the possibility of also going beyond this stylistic analysis through close reading of stylistic details. Emily Dickinson, comparing Emily Dickinson's text and the cucumber piece, and using stylometry, distant reading analysis, which uses compares frequencies of words, symbols, letters, and distributes the text by levels of similitude. And my preliminary results showed that by comparing the sources of Susan Dickinson, various pieces from Dickinson, Thoreau, and Emerson, that the commencement week piece resembled mostly the style of Dickinson's. And to conclude, why this discovery is important, I would say that the cucumber piece would be of Dickinson's earliest printed publication, 1848, and it gives rich insight into her style preferences and where she developed from as a writer. It grants us a deep understanding of Dickinson's connection to the world around her, and actually can uncover more about her early readings. We have possibly Rob Roy, Mrs. Hemans, and possible reference to Emerson's Nature through The Great Eye of the World is peeled. But finally, I also, in a way of a joke, wanted to say that the same way the Indicator Journal issue with Dickinson's 1850 Valentine was sold at auction for around $10,000, my discovery will also open a good financial prospect, or at least to attract more audience to the Amherst College Library, and which can be done the same with this case of the cucumber piece. And in conclusion, I want to use this opportunity to share my new podcast, which is called Emily Dickinson Unheard. And thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Thank you, Vladislav. That was fascinating. Let's move on to the next paper. So we're going to hear from Caitlin Gerrard, Fragments to Wholes, Print and Electronic Mediations of Dickinson's Poems. Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen first. Okay. Can everyone see? Okay, nice. Thanks. Okay, so you might notice that the title displayed here is a little different from the title displayed on the program. And that's because my thinking about Dickinson's Fragments has evolved as I've progressed in my research. And I just felt that this title was more fitting. My presentation today echoes an argument previously put forth by scholars such as Virginia Jackson and Michael Cohen, that an overinvestment in Dickinson's singularity as a lyric poet has led us to neglect the ways her late fragments might actually coincide or play with the literary conventions of her time. I'll test this question against Marta Werner's digital archive, Radical Scatters, which is one of the great achievements of Dickinson digital humanities scholarship, and also, as I'll suggest in this presentation, a resource encumbered by the contradictions between historical literary genres and modern methods of lyric interpretation that have become a prevalent topic in discussions regarding 19th century poetry. Werner has done more than almost anyone to recover the material specificity of Dickinson's late manuscripts. She tells us in an essay titled A Woe of Ecstasy that her method aims to encourage speculation about the relationship between message and medium, and that at moments, the medium and message of Dickinson's fragments are one and the same. In Jackson's study of Dickinson, she contests Werner's supposition, maintaining that the lyric genre predetermines how we approach the late fragments. These tensions between lyric interpretation and historical poetics will be central to my thinking in this presentation today. In an essay titled Most Arrows, Werner postulates that the fragments exemplify a kind of lyric non-discourse that is extra-generic, or in other words, that exists outside of the prescriptions of conventional genres. Classifying the fragments as extra-generic renders the relation between Dickinson's writings and 19th century literary culture insignificant. Werner envisions Dickinson's fragments as transcendent of historical literary genres, and therefore as sort of preternaturally anticipative of modern lyric. My argument is that Werner's dual inclinations as a textual materialist and a lyric reader are at odds with one another in her presentation of Dickinson's fragments. Werner's scrupulous organization of the fragments is an indispensable resource for understanding the material context of Dickinson's compositional practices. But in her introductory essays to the digital archive, her tendency to lyricize the fragments detracts from this emphasis on textual and material fidelity. Before diving into the specifics of Radical Scatters, I wanted to spend some time contextualizing the place of the fragment in American literary culture. Literary fragments, although typically associated with German or British Romanticism, proved just as popular with American readers in the decades following the Revolutionary War. Daniel Diaz Couch's book, American Fragments, shows us that American print culture was suffused with fragments. The fundamental unfinishedness of the fragment offered a kind of liberatory potential for marginalized writers and audiences of the early Republic. By the mid-19th century, the literary fragment had calcified into its own canonical genre, losing the transgressive charge it carried at the end of the 18th century. Just because fragments are generic does not necessarily mean that Dickinson's own fragments fit the form's generic expectations. But given Dickinson's acquaintance with Keats and Byron, it is reasonable to surmise that she had encountered the romantic fragment in her own reading, and that these fragments influenced her compositional practices in the later years of her life. As many of you are probably already aware, during most of her life, Dickinson maintained a practice of binding her finished poems into booklets. But in her final years, she abandoned this routine and left her poems as single scraps and worksheets. Radical Scatters offers facsimiles and transcriptions of these fragments, as well as precise physical descriptions of the materials Dickinson used to create them. Werner's fastidiousness as a digital archivist is evident in her intricate assembly of the website. She developed her own classification schema for the fragments, disaggregating them into 3 subgroups. The first being autonomous fragments, the second trace fragments, and the third variant fragments. Linked below these subgroups is a series of document constellations or clusters of related texts, which allow the user to explore the connections between different fragments. Some fragments slip through these classifications. For instance, fragment A112, a tiny piece of brown wrapping paper which reads, "A woe of ecstasy," and it's pictured here. In her essay, Most Arrows, Werner writes that fragment A112 exists in 2 textual spaces at once, in the poem message as a variant or rhyming trace of its final line, and as an autonomous lyric throw, not jettisoned once the poem is finished, but translated into another economy altogether. What surfaces here is a lyric reading. Although Werner does not classify fragment A112 as an autonomous fragment, she interprets it as such in her introductory essay to the archive. Here I've selected another fragment for closer consideration, fragment A858, a text which I think benefits more from a materially and historically grounded kind of interpretation than an ahistorical lyric reading. Werner tells us that this fragment was written on the leaf of a law book, presumably the book of Edward or Austin Dickinson, both of whom were lawyers. The fragment reads, "I saw 2 bushes fight just now. The wind was to blame, but to see them differ was pretty as a lawsuit. Nature is so sudden, she makes us all antique." A few sentences of the law book are visible above the torn edges of the fragment. Dickinson's penciled phrases hover in the top margins of the page. A connection appears between Dickinson's lines and the material she chose to write them on. She riffs on the matters enumerated in the page's printed text, imagining the scuffle between bushes as a legal dispute. This unlikely metaphor of rustling bushes of a lawsuit may have occurred almost involuntarily to Dickinson because matters of law and business filled the atmosphere of the Dickinson household, as is made obvious by the fact of her choice of material. A book by James Guthrie titled A Kiss from Thermopylae, Emily Dickinson in Law, offers a scholarly perspective on the legal terminology abounding in Dickinson's poems, as well as 19th century American attitudes towards the legal profession. Dickinson learned about the law vicariously through her father and brother. During the early years of her life, the profession was enjoying something of a golden age. But after the Civil War, during the turbulent years of Reconstruction, anxiety dominated American dispositions towards the law. Guthrie writes that after her father's death in 1874, Dickinson's poems and letters displayed an increasing uneasiness over the dangers posed by a perceived spread of lawlessness. Given that this decade was marked by fluctuations in American attitudes toward the law, we might consider Dickinson's phrase, "pretty as a lawsuit," as indicative of her own aversion to socio-political upheaval and her preference for stable, changeless processes of adjudication. Some self-consciousness of the stiffness of this preference emerges in the final lines with the remark that viewing the stirring bushes as a legal dispute renders humankind antique or outmoded and estranged from nature. She finds humor in the human impulse to measure nature's spontaneity against legal process, a move which seems to deflate the law's authority and make legal language antique against the fast and volatile movements of nature. By reflecting on the relationship between law and nature on the page of a law book, Dickinson reveals how literature is absorbed into everyday life. She invites her reader to think through her lines as well as the materials they were composed on and the multiple genres of literary and legal writing that they entail. What Dickinson leaves us with is an artifact, an object of cultural and historical significance that cannot be abstracted into pure voice and feeling. Rather than an instance of lyric non-discourse, Fragment A 858 is an instance of historical thinking. It is a piece of literature made specifically out of the conditions of the world that it emerged from. Thank you for listening. I'm excited to hear any thoughts you might have. I'll stop.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Caitlin. That was great. And now we will move to our final presentation on this panel and hopefully have a good amount of time for Q&A. So finally, we will hear from Susen Halank. I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong. That Such a Realm Could Be Dickinson's Alternative Epistolary Magazine.
Yes, thank you. I'll just also share my screen. Okay, here we go. I think you should be able to see it, right? Okay, good. Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for organizing this wonderful panel on Dickinson and genre. I want to use this presentation today to talk about one subchapter of my PhD project, in which I studied the combination of verse and prose in the letters of Emily Dickinson, Elizabeth Bishop, and Sylvia Plath. Dickinson's letters, as you all know, constitute one of the most experimental bodies of 19th century American correspondence, revealing an unprecedented yet understudied combination of epistolary and poetic practice that I call prose poetry practices. Poems being embedded in the prose, in this case, in private letters. Avoiding what Mariette Messmer has called a, quote, patriarchal editorial practice, end quote, of separating letter and poem, my study of Dickinson's prose poetry practices demonstrates how she develops her own language and poetic norms precisely by combining and thus challenging epistolary and poetic practices alike. In my research, I define several functions of Dickinson's prose poetry practices and letters, but I want to focus today on what I call her intellectual ones. While there are different purposes and contents of such intellectual prose poetry practices, I find that they can constitute a platform for developing literary ideas and practicing literary criticism. Outside the structures of the mainstream press, Dickinson's letters create a space where she's in control without being publicly challenged for her perspectives. Her letters with prose poetry practices then function as more than what Eleanor Higginbotham has described as an epistolary book club. They are, in fact, serious sites of literary criticism and constitute an alternative literary magazine. I argue that in this magazine, Dickinson shares her poetry, performs as a literary critic, writes reviews and eulogies, and offers revisions, effectively participating in many of the same critical practices associated with 19th century literary culture, but through an alternative medium. Her subtle criticisms, reinforced by intertextual allusions in prose and extended through verse, assert her authority within a male-dominated literary culture, using her epistolary platform as a literary magazine whose variety is only revealed when Dickinson's prose poetry practices are studied systematically. Today, I cannot offer the systematic studies, but I would like to present one reading of this magazine and trace Dickinson's role as a critic. Even though Dickinson's establishment as critic and writer has not gone unnoticed in scholarship, especially regarding her correspondence with Thomas Wentworth Higginson, there has not been a focus on her prose poetry practices in this context. These prose poetry practices create an ideal space for critical engagement, allowing her to analyze and rewrite Higginson's work. In doing so, Dickinson establishes herself as a literary intellectual equal, if not even more gifted than Higginson or other male contemporaries. One famous example includes Dickinson's rewriting of Higginson's poem Decoration into Latest Laurel on the One. Yet, once again, the fact that this happens in the context of a prose poetry practice has not been analyzed. My following argument expands Messmer's observation that Dickinson read most of Higginson's work she not only, quote, becomes Higginson's stylistic critic almost as much as he had become hers, end quote, but in fact, she subtly positions herself as capable of rewriting his work while posing as his scholar. The before-mentioned decoration letter may be the best-known example of Dickinson's engagement with Higginson's text, but several earlier prose poetry practices illustrate a sustained critical dialogue with his writing. In January of 1863, Dickinson writes a long letter to Higginson to engage with his 1862 article, The Procession of Flowers, published in The Atlantic, both as an admirer and as a critic. In the article, Higginson explores the secret movements of vegetation and argues that the, quote, humble movements of our local plants may supply evidence of Earth's changes upon some smaller scale, end quote. He also explains that close observation of nature reveals finer adaptations, describing how, quote, the change of seasons is analogous to a change of zones, and summer assimilates our vegetation to that of the tropics, end quote. Beginning with a Cuban shrub that attracts hummingbirds, its petal called Cupid's tears, he traces the bloom of various New England flowers throughout the year, noting that tints and fascinations of minor beauty can be perceived even in winter. The essay concludes by reflecting on the disconnect between nature and humankind, and Higginson closes on stating that no human art can compete with nature, writing that, quote, yet one ought to be able, by the mere use of language, to supply to every reader the total of that white, honeyed, trailing sweetness which summer insects haunt and the spirit of the universe loves. The defect's not in language, but in men, end quote. In this final conclusion on language and men that becomes central, it is this final conclusion on language and men that becomes central in Dickinson's 1863 response to Higginson. I will not read out the entire letter, but I have it on the slides here, and I highlight the parts I will talk about in the following. So, following a similar logic than Higginson, Dickinson's response engages critically with his reflections on art, nature, and humanity. She even mentions Higginson's article in the postscript of the letter, ensuring he recognizes her allusions in the preceding prose. She writes, I trust the procession of flowers was not a premonition. Throughout the letter, Dickinson agrees with several of Higginson's observations, but arrives at different conclusions, justifying her expertise by presenting herself at the beginning of the letter as in tune with the non-human world and accompanied by her dog, her Ellie. At first, she follows Higginson's argument. She begins with an island, Cuba, in Higginson's text, and enlists flowers according to their bloom, starting with a rose and magnolia, the rose corresponding to Higginson's description of a Christmas rose and several wild roses. And then Dickinson follows this by the blackberry. Dickinson shares Higginson's fascinations about seasonal changes, but adds a twist, disenchanting the supernatural through a pun. She writes, I was thinking today, as I noticed that the supernatural was only the natural disclosed. In relation to this, her first poem resonates differently. Best gains must have the losses test to constitute them gains. The verse emphasizes humanity's incapability of perceiving nature accurately, which is further underlined by the inversion, gains are only realized through loss, and then finally approved of by her non-human shaggy alley. Through this, Dickinson transforms Higginson's reflections into a meditation on perception itself, setting the stage for a criticism of human limitation, which relates to her critical thoughts on the natural environment at large and is in tune with the non-human world. Dickinson criticizes a different aspect of humanity than Higginson by dismantling the relation between the natural and the supernatural further in the second poem. Not revelation that waits, but our unfurnished eyes. Even as prose and verse are distinguished by meter, she links them through a similar sentence structure that reveals her ideas. What appears supernatural is simply the natural disclosed, and what seems revelation is only perception. Further, Dickinson constructs a shared ground on which to think together by moving from the epistolary I to an inclusive our in the verse. She acknowledges the limits of language, agreeing with Higginson that men are flawed, but she suggests that the defect Higginson observed does not lie in language, but in perception itself. When she realizes the disenchantment of the supernatural that leaves behind the natural, she concludes that the problem lies not in revelation, but in humanity's unfurnished eyes. The real failure, then, lies not in noticing the beauty of nature in the first place. This creates a subtle compliment for Higginson, since he at least perceived seasonal change and wrote about it. However, Dickinson challenges him on his final argument, which questions the power of human language. Humbly, Dickinson finally concludes her reflection on the procession of flowers, fearing to detain Higginson. Yet her humility seems to function less as a deference than as a discursive marker. The modest pose flatters Higginson, while Dickinson pretends to conceal her intellectual size, for she just distilled her stance on humanity, the natural world, and beauty into a form as powerful, yet shorter than Higginson's. Her signature, gnome, further reinforces this posture of smallness while also gesturing toward the creature's cunning, non-human qualities, providing her argument with an additional, more than human dimension. Dickinson asserts a critical authority that is masked by humility, endorsed by non-human agencies, and freed from any publisher's demands or revision requests in this letter. She appears to employ this prose poetry practice as a platform to review and expand Higginson's article by simultaneously engaging him in a critical dialogue that touches upon her thoughts about the natural environment. Prose poetry practices as spaces in which Dickinson can inhabit multiple roles, including those of eulogist, critic, and friend, by associating the semi-private sphere of the letter with the public character of a literary magazine, of which I'm only able to present this one reading today. This literary magazine contributes to the consideration of Dickinson in relation to a canon and to examining her critical voice, resulting in a complicated yet intersecting practice of negotiating influences. Dickinson refrains from making her thoughts public through a traditional form of publication, but extends them through an intimate public, as Lauren Ballant would call it, to chosen correspondence in a context that appears to be productive for her writing and her thinking. Her epistolary platform therefore resembles contemporary magazines in content, writing reviews, reactions, eulogies, and poems, but only addresses an audience who presumably appreciates her insights and reads all of her output. Ultimately, this provides her with a trusted readership and agency over her own texts, creating an alternative, even proto-feminist, radical, and communicative space in which her poetry can unfold. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you to everyone for such great presentations. I'd love to open it up for discussion. We have a lot of time. I think maybe we can begin with the question that Martha Nell had for Vladislav during your presentation, Vladislav. And that was, and maybe I know that I rushed you a little bit also. So if you wanted to talk more about that stylometry graph that you had, that you could maybe do that as well. So, but Martha Nell's question was, have you, or maybe Martha Nell, would you like to ask
Sure.
this
Yes,
now?
okay.
First of all, thanks to all three of you for, once again, fabulous presentations. I'm so happy. Anyway, Vladislav, maybe you saw my question, but I'm wondering, and you addressed this when you were looking at style, but I could also take some of what you're arguing, and you seem to dismiss Susan, and I was thinking, this sounds, especially if you compare to her prose writings that were also published in the Springfield Republican. So, did you consider any other Dickinson writers?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and thanks for asking. Yeah, I've just been reading right now. I haven't seen it before. Yes, I considered, and indeed, especially for my stylometric analysis, and so trying to be as objective as possible. Obviously, it would require comparing any person we have, any data we have from any person from Amherst to really individuate and compare with different styles amongst people. And here, obviously, it's just, especially considering this stylistic analysis through close readings, just cherry picking practically a person, in our case, Emily Dickinson. Although there are several coincidences that I wanted to share with you that make you think more, but especially, yes, this project would be a good exercise in attracting more attention to manuscripts by other writers in Dickinson's household, in Amherst in general, especially by students and Amherst College and Amherst Academy. Because, yes, for my stylometric analysis, which is, as I said, just preliminary and very basic, I've extracted.
Very good.
Yes, thanks. But I had the best idea I had, especially thanks to digital archives, is to extract Susan Gilbert Dickinson's writings, uh, which could be more difficult, for example, to do the same process with Austin's writings or other students whom we do not have in a digital form at this point, and would require this transition from manuscript to the digital to be able to analyze in this manner. But yes, telemetric analysis could do this more complex, execute this more complex task. And at the beginning, was just a lightning strike in case of Dickinson's, which I tried to investigate more, which I will try to do more.
Well, and if I may just quickly say, I'm not really challenging so much as I think you're opening up a window into how much writing and reading and exchanging each other's writings were central to what, like, we sit around and talk about, TV or whatever. I don't know what we do in the evening. You know what I mean? But they, like we do things in the evening, that's what they were doing. And I do think that's gotten lost a little bit. So thank you for bringing it forward.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Thank you. If there are other questions, you can use the raise hand function, and I'm happy to call on you, or can put it in the chat and I can broadcast it. Sure, Martha now.
If y'all want me to shut up, just say, Martha, enough is enough. But Caitlin, I like Ladislaw. I loved all three of these papers, and you may have seen my question, and I've asked this question. Marta and I have had endless discussions about this, but what about fragments that have been lost? I mean, we know there have to be fragments lost. Um, Maybe we don't know that. But what about that? And you talked very well about any order that's there, we're imposing as readers. So, and I really love the way you tied it to fragments and other writers. And, one could argue that Moby Dick is one long list of fragments. But anyway, I
Thank
wondered if
you for your question. Oh, yeah.
I wondered if you
Um,
could talk even more.
yeah, from what I can tell, many of the fragments digitized on the Radical Scatters website were first published in 1955 in the New England Quarterly article by Millicent Todd Bingham. Like the one that I used as an example today was first published there. Um, and I think in that article, Bingham says that she received this chest from Mabel Loomis Todd after her mother, her mother, I believe, Todd was her mother, right? Um, uh, died. So I think, yeah, all of those fragments were just the ones that were locked up in that chest. So it's very possible that there were other ones that weren't included. Um, And I think it's hard to tell too how much that article kind of like set the stage for how we like interpret um the fragments now. Um but yeah, I'm sure like uh that's like a very possible um difficulty. But and your question too about knowing who the fragments are addressed to is also really important. Even in the fragment that I showed in my presentation, even though it was written on a law book, and so we might like assume that it's related to Dickinson's father or brother, I think there's no way to be sure that it was actually addressed to them, or it could have just been some piece of material that was in her vicinity. Yeah. Um, but yeah, thank you for the questions. So yeah, important to address.
Well, it's fascinating, and it makes us think in terms of abundance rather than lack. And I will simply say, as an editor myself, I think editors too often get caught up and think in terms of lack. And by that, I mean, they're like, this is what this means. We don't, I mean, come on, but you're getting us to think in terms of abundance and things being generative. And it's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. I see a bunch of hands, so we'll start with Cole. Take it away.
Thanks. Yeah. I'm sorry if you can hear it. My 1-year-old is going like ballistic downstairs right now. Um, Kaylin, I have a sort of follow-up question and just a general interest question. I love the fragments. I love the marginalia stuff. I love the envelope poems, as it were. And I wonder, in your looking across the fragmented stuff, the marginalia stuff, uh, do you ever find like correlations between content and the thing on which it's written? Because we know that sometimes Dickinson would like shape envelopes or whatever into houses, and there's a pretty famous poem, like marginal poem, that's about a house on a house, so to speak. And I was interested by what you were saying about like um, intentional language about law or potentially being on a law fragment. Um, do you find that that there's ever correlation between content and whatever the medium is?
Yeah, I think it's like a really interesting parallel that comes up with the fragments. And yeah, I think in the introductory essays to the archive, Werner writes more about, I think she writes about a, a text about a bird or a wing that's on a piece of paper that's shaped like a wing. And then there's the envelope poems as well. Um, yeah, and I think it like when the kind of text calls back to the material that the text is written on, it requires like a different kind of reading that the digitization like allows for, because we're able to see the original material. Um, but yeah, it like requires like an interesting change in like position maybe where it's we can consider like the physical attributes of the text to like and how they contribute to the text meaning. Um, yeah, thank you for your question.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you. It's really interesting. Yeah, it almost like shifts medium or something, like it becomes more
Mhm.
visual. Um, cool. Thanks.
Great. Li Shin?
Well, thank you so much for such a beautiful panel. My quick question is probably more for Susan. I'm really enjoying your reading of Dickinson's sort of like self-administered literary magazine style, and especially draw on the comparison, her close reading of Higginson there, which I really love. I wonder whether you can say a bit about Higginson's side, because Higgins also has this really like interesting, sometimes awkward relationship with Dickinson in terms of how he responds to Dickinson's reference to or echo of his words. So I wonder do you think Higgins is aware of her practice of this epistolary magazine style, or what's your take on that?
Thank you for your question, and it's so good to see you. It's very frustrating when you're working on the Dickinson letters because there's not so many responses. It would be so fascinating to have the entire Higginson, all the letters Higginson sent to her, for example. I'm not aware of a letter in response to this one. And there is a bunch of letters that actually work in a similar way. So, for example, his article, A Shadow, also gets a response from Dickinson, and it works similarly. So she kind of completely deconstructs it, giving him a compliment while still, well, that is my argument, still saying, well, but you still missed the main point. And I will just put it in a poem and then maybe you'll get it. At least that's one way to read it. Yeah, can't really say a lot about his responses. I always hope that he got it, and that he understood what she was getting at, but I'm sometimes not so sure he was able to. But maybe he was one of her. Yeah, I think I make a point in my dissertation also that at one point she stops writing these prose poetry practices to Samuel Bowles and starts writing them only to Higginson, or not only to Higginson, but these intellectual ones, specifically to Higginson. So she seems, or at least from the correspondence we still have, she seems to have selected him as like an intellectual equal with whom to discuss these things. So I'm sure there were responses that would have been interesting to analyze, but I'm just not sure that they survive, unfortunately.
That's great. Thanks.
Thank you. I think Elizabeth, probably we'll have time for your question, and then that maybe might close us off. Is that right, Perek? Is that okay? Please,
Okay.
Elizabeth.
Thank you. And thank you all. These were so terrific as papers. And just really quickly, I wanted to ask a couple of questions, one to Vlad and then the other to Susan. And so one, I'm wondering about the reference, Vlad, to Felicia Hemans, because that was so interesting that you have so many ways of looking at the style. Hemans, I'm just wondering about Hemans as a kind of, early 19th century British figure at a time when perhaps, the Scots and the Brits were being elevated within America. And so just generally, what you think Dickinson might have been doing, if it is in fact Dickinson, with a reference to Felicia Hemans. And then for Susan, your idea about prose poetic practices is so, I think, generative. I don't know if you know, Mary Leffelholtz has an essay also on the idea of mixed genre and relationships between narrative and poems and the way in which they're interspersed, particularly, I think, in the work of Lucy Larcombe. And I'm wondering, in reference, I love the idea of Dickinson as a literary critic, and I'm wondering about what you think about her letter early on, of course, the first couple of letters that she wrote to Higginson in response to Letter to a Young Contributor, right? Itself a letter that's published in the Atlantic Monthly, to which Dickinson responds really subtly, using all sorts of images that he uses as well. So yeah, I'm sure we'll continue this conversation.
So yeah, I will go first. Mentioning Mrs. Hemans, as someone refers to her in this piece, and supposedly Dickinson, but very much it seems so. The point would be is that definitely demonstrates the popularity of the writer, of her being important on the American stage, along with indeed Walter Scott or Charles Dickens and other British writers. And what I can say specifically about Dickinson and the surrounding, indeed my research in various journals, magazines, and publications of Dickinson's period, especially the first half of the 19th century, really demonstrates how the poet herself was quite popular among Americans in general. Not only in this case, it could be also an argument for the cucumber author mentioning Mrs. Hemans being female. But anyway, from my experience, I saw others mention Mrs. Hemans and referencing her poetry pretty often. So it would be just really part of a pop culture to mention her and mention rather Mrs. Hemans than anyone else. And I suppose this would be one of the first indicators of what her presence means in this piece. And then obviously we need to investigate more of, as I remember, there are citations in Emily Dickinson or Mrs. Hemans. So obviously it would be also quite natural in her particular case as an author to remember about and mention a female author, a fellow female author in this piece.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I can't really say a lot on the first letter to Higginson because that's not really part of my research because she doesn't put a poem into it in the sense of there is not a poem within the body, like the prose body of the letter. But what I can say is that the second letter she sends him, where she also sends as if I asked a common alms to him, that this one I found very interesting, and I think that looking at it from the perspective of prose poetry practices, and then in this broader systemic study that I did with all of these texts, what turns out is that Dickinson has a form of subverted gratitude. So she pretends to thank especially male correspondents, but she's not actually thanking them. She's saying something completely different. And this is also what I think is happening here. So she thanks him for the surgery, right? But she puts in another poem. And I read it with a certain tone of irony, which I know other scholars have also already detected. But it becomes really clear then in the ongoing correspondence that they have that she uses this letter to really establish the relationship she wants to have with them, I think. She wants it to be an intellectual exchange. At some point, many years later, she writes that the vein cannot thank the artery. So Higginson and herself are kind of connected, just as like a blood circuit. He gives her ideas, she can kind of deconstruct them and do something new with them. And I think it also works the other way around.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you again. And thank you for your patience. I know there's a new panel starting now. So another virtual round of applause for Susan, Caitlin, and Vlad. And thank you all for joining.